Well, good afternoon and welcome to an FS Club webinar on an interesting day here in London, as we're seeing something that is statistically unusual, a fairly heavy snowfall in December. And I'm delighted, therefore, to be able to interrogate the chief meteorologist, Ed Humpherson, the Director General for Regulation at the UK Statistics Authority. Ed is a dear old friend, and we've long commiserated on the need to really improve measurement and number capture throughout all of society. But Ed has a particularly important role here in the United Kingdom, regulating the UK Statistics Authority, of which we'll hear more about later. Now, you've seen Ed's CV, and you also know me. I'm Michael Mainelli, one of the directors of SIEN. But I'm only able to join the team in presenting these webinars thanks to the tolerance, generosity, and wide-ranging interest of our sponsors, who allow us to go widely and freely across many areas of technology, economics, and finance. And certainly one thing that unites all three sectors of technology, economics, and finance is numbers. These are a numbers game. Well, the format, as you know, also relies on numbers, and that's that I need to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from our expert. Ed will be speaking for approximately 20 minutes, then we've got approximately 20 minutes for a good question and answer session. 3 points of housekeeping, if I may. Yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will go up in approximately 2 working days, so probably late on Wednesday, definitely in time for the Christmas viewing season. Set aside all of those long films, boring Bond films, and watch the entire FS Club oeuvre. Secondly, how do you participate and ask questions? Very straightforwardly, use the GoToWebinar chat facility. Ed will be getting a copy of all the questions with your email attached. So if it's just, Ed, I need to talk to you, if it's you want to point something out to him, flash them through, but I'll pull your questions out and feed them to Ed during the Q&A session. In fact, I noticed we've already got a question or two here, so do keep them coming. And very finally, yes, the slides will be available. In fact, possibly already are available, so keep an eye on the chat room. But anyway, I believe we're going to start off with a poll. Is that correct, Ed?
I'm going to say a couple of words, and then we're going to go for our poll.
Excellent. So, folks, do keep your fingers on the buzzers. I believe Ed has two polls as well, so stay alert. Ed, the floor is very much yours.
Great. Okay, I'm going to talk about data everywhere, the consequences, the implications of living in a world of data abundance. And this title came up because a couple of years ago I thought this would be quite a neat name for a talk, and I quickly Googled data everywhere. Maybe you could try this, and discovered that lots of people use the phrase data everywhere. It's almost a bit of a meme. It comes up in lots of presentations. Here are just 4 screenshots of some presentations that I found. Now, those of you who have a literary bent will know that the phrase data everywhere is a sort of little nod to the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, or a great romantic poem, where the quote begins, water everywhere. So my first poll is just to see what kind of audience we have, how literary you are. What is the correct completion of the quote? Water everywhere. I give you 4 options. Choose what you think is the correct answer, and we will see you on the other side. So do select what you think is the right answer.
Well, Ed, our audience is always opinionated and really quite well informed, although we're almost there. We've got 81% have voted, and here comes the results. Ed, are you ready to disappointment?
I am ready. Are you going to flash it up on my screen so I get to see?
It should be showing now. So we have nothing to drink, 0, and not yet anything to drink, also 0, nor any drop to drink, 14%, and thus by consequence, 86% said, and not a drop to drink.
Oh dear.
To break the bad news.
So well, I'll ask you, Michael. Let's put you on the spot. What do you think the correct answer is?
It should be, I believe, as a Coleridge fan, nor any drop to drink. So I'm very much in the 14% minority.
The 14% are correct. It's one of those classic quotes that people get wrong, a bit like "Play it again, Sam." It's water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. That will recur later in this presentation, not least because A big part of my role is veracity and accuracy. It matters a lot in lots of things, as I'm about to explain. So I'm going to talk about the consequences of data abundance. Going to go through 3 aspects of data abundance: the weaponization of data, the idea of context collapse, and the idea of information overload. Let me begin, though, by a little bit about what I do. I'm the head of the Office for Statistics Regulation. We are the regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority, which is the UK's Department for Statistics. Our role is to promote and safeguard the production and publication of official statistics. We don't produce statistics, and we're separate from the Office for National Statistics. The ONS are the producers, we're their regulator. We also regulate all the government departments and the way they both produce and use statistics. And you'll see some examples of what we do later. We have three components to our role. We look at how statistics are produced, how they're collected, how they are measured, how they're reported. We also look at how they're used, and we see our role as protecting how statistics are used in public debate. And that's going to be a big feature of what I talk about. And we also talk about how statistics are valued, how they are actually a valuable commodity for society. So that's our role. What we deliver is really 3 types of output. We have an excellent code of practice for statistics, which is a statutory obligation on all parts of government. When they publish statistics, they must do so in line with the code of practice. We also assess whether that is being complied with, whether the code is being followed, and if it is, we give a kite mark, this national statistics kite mark, to those statistics that meet the code of practice in full. And you won't be able to read that, but that's actually a letter to somebody you may have heard of. It's called Matt Hancock, sometime Minister for Health. That was a letter to him. It's an example of a very important tool that we have, which is when we write publicly to politicians about the way they've used statistics. This was a letter to Matt Hancock about testing statistics. So that's what we deliver. Everything we do comes back to a triptych, a 3-pillar concept called TQV: trustworthiness, quality, and value. We always look for these 3 things. We look for trustworthiness in the organization communicating statistics, and this is that they must provide usable evidence that allows others to check that they are trustworthy. Secondly, we look for quality. Statistics must be the best available measure of what they aim to represent and shouldn't be materially misleading. And we look for value. Statistics have got to be valuable, and value is defined as helping people answer questions. It's no good having lots of very detailed statistics on the number of paper clips in circulation in the economy, because that's not a very relevant question to society. So I'm going to start by the weaponization of data. And what I mean by that is the way in which, in political discourse, and actually in societal discourse, charities do this a lot as well. They'll pick a number, they'll use it over and over again, like a piece of artillery, pounding away at their opponents, pounding away at the case they've made, until the data ceases to be used as a piece of information, is more a piece of persuasion. That's what we mean by the weaponization of data, and it infringes the T in TQV. It infringes trustworthiness. Let me give you an example. This is another person that was a figure of the past. This is Boris Johnson, sometime Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. One of his weaponized pieces of data was to say a lot that there are 430,000 more people in employment than before the pandemic began. This was his bit of artillery, pounded away constantly. When asked the question about how the country was doing, he'd roll this out: 430,000 more people in employment than before the pandemic began. Well, let's look at the actual figures. This is produced by the Office for National Statistics, who measure employment in the economy. It shows that if you look at the top bar, the bar above naught, there is actually indeed an increase in full-time employees. That's good. However, you also see that there's a decline from 0. There's a decline in the number of part-time employees and decline in the number of self-employed. If you put those movements together, full-time, part-time, self-employed, you get the total unemployment figure. And you see that from before the pandemic, December to February 2020, through to February 2022, actually the green line representing the total unemployment has fallen. So it's not the case that there are 430,000 more people in employment. There's actually fewer. So this is clearly an example of a piece of data which has been weaponized, but it's been weaponized and become detached from what the evidence actually says. What do? Well, we wrote repeatedly to Downing Street. This is a Guardian article which highlights the intervention we made, culminating in us writing directly to the Prime Minister to say this is too selective, it's incorrect, and ultimately Boris Johnson stopped using this incorrect figure. So that's an example of the weaponization of data and how it causes problems, and the antidote to weaponization, which is stepping in to correct. Let me talk about context collapse. Very different type of consequence of living in a data abundant world. Context collapse is an idea that I've learned from a philosopher at Cambridge University called Lucy MacDonald. And she made the observation that social media platforms facilitate context collapse. And that is that things which in the past might have been in separate audiences, a professional audience, a family audience, a special interest group audience, collide into one online on social media. And she says, online conversation is like turning up to a busy park where some people play cricket and others play baseball. And the consequence of that is that conversations get confused. And in fact, sometimes deliberately. In other words, imagine some people trying to disrupt a game of cricket by coming in to play baseball roles. They're deliberately disrupting these conversations which should be separate. Now, you might be wondering, what's that got to do with statistics? I'll give you an example. These are vaccine surveillance statistics published by the UK Health Security Agency. Very helpful piece of data. It's provided by that agency for epidemiologists, for public health officials across the country, giving them information to help them do their job. It's a very professional bit of discourse. And it shows the total number of cases of COVID. It shows the number of those who are not vaccinated. It shows those who have received doses, and then it shows the rates. All fairly straightforward, very useful for people who are planning public health interventions. But hang on, there's something strange. So if you look at the under 18s, you'd see that the rates amongst the people who are not vaccinated is way, way higher than the rates among people vaccinated. That makes sense. That's suggesting that vaccines work because you have a higher rate amongst the unvaccinated. But as you go down that column into the higher age bands, and I've picked out the 70 to 79, the reverse is true. Very strange. You see that actually there's almost a double rate amongst the 70 to 79 amongst the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. What to do about this? Well, you'll see the caveats at the bottom there. The second caveat, it reads, interpretation of the case rates in vaccinated and unvaccinated population is particularly susceptible to changes in denominators and should be interpreted with extra caution. So they're saying, as the experts, speaking to experts, just be cautious. We think there's something going on with the composition of the numbers. Unfortunately, context collapse happened. You had the Joe Rogan podcast, which picked up on this number, used it out of context, and used it to argue that vaccines weren't effective. You see that there was a widespread use amongst anti-vaxxers of this information, called here a global vaccine myth. The UK HSA said, well, you know, it's a long-standing methodology. It's our expert discourse. We're not going to shift the goalposts. We're not going to change anything because that would give oxygen to the issue. In other words, they wanted to stay within their professional context and not realize that the context had collapsed and the data had broken out into a completely different context. We stepped in. We judged this was risky. The communication of data is more than just presenting numbers. And we think this whole scenario provides a lesson on the harm when data are not well explained and when contexts collapse. Let me give another example of context collapse, which is much happier. This is an FOI release by the Office for National Statistics, summarizing the numbers of people where on their death certificate there's COVID with no other underlying cause. And a number came out with a number of death certificates which only mentioned COVID. But the ONS did not want to make the mistake of UKHSA. They wanted to respond to this very specific piece of information getting out into a different context. And what they did was they highlighted that there was extensive misrepresentation of this information. They published it, but they highlighted extensive misrepresentation. And they did a very clear blog which said it's highly misleading and explained why. So they responded to this very specific piece of information getting out of its original context and going out into other contexts. I'll skip over that. This is all really came to my mind when I heard the Freedom of Speech Wreath lecture this year by the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She gave a wonderful lecture about freedom of speech, but she had this quote within it, which I love. She said, "In this age of mounting disinformation all over the world, when it is easy to dress up a lie so nicely that it starts to take on the glow of truth, the solution is not to hide the lie, but to expose it and scrub from it its false glow." And that's the endeavour that we are involved in the Office for Statistics Regulation. I just want to speak very briefly about information overload, which I think speaks to the V in TQV, to the value. Let's go back to our data everywhere presentations. What I think is great about this is that each of these presentations slightly use the data everywhere phrase differently. So the first one just went for a straight data everywhere. This one tried to be a bit cleverer, data everywhere and not a drop to drink, which is sort of like showing that the producer of this presentation did sort of know a little bit of poetry, got the quote wrong, but you know, as we now know, got the quote wrong, but trying hard. This one tried a bit harder, data everywhere and not a bit to help. Let's see what he did there. And the final one, which is my favorite because it's so clunky, data everywhere and not an insight to take action upon. Very clunky, but all of these things speak to a sense of being overwhelmed, of there being an overload of information. We're living in a society which is so datafied, it's very hard to navigate our way through it. Now, for us, the antidote to that is to not actually go data crazy, dump data out, make loads and loads of data available, but is to think very carefully about what is published. And the best example I can give of that is the coronavirus dashboard published by the UK. This is a screenshot of it from March 2021. The thing about this dashboard is it wasn't just dumping data on people, it was used intensively. You see the stats there on the right hand side. 40 million individual figures published at 4 p.m. each day, 19 million page views. At its peak day, which I think was this day that I've screenshot, 9th of March 2021, 76 million hits. The reason we know that this is not information overload is that the number of people who were accessing this, using it to help them make their judgments and their choices. This dashboard was developed not as a data dump, but it was developed as a very simple dashboard in its early days, and gradually it grew. More data was made available, more users requested more information, and it was driven by the user value, not by just making lots of data available. I think it's a great example of combating information overload, not by being information led, but by being led by the questions users have. So I have another poll question. Now I've rattled through misuse of data. I've given 3 manifestations of data abundance: weaponisation, context, collapse, information overload. Interested in your thoughts as to what the most significant risk factor causing misuse of data is. So be interested in your reactions.
Excellent. Well, we've just launched that poll there, and I won't say which one is my favorite, but I definitely have one. Well, actually, sort of two. But we've got 3/4 of the audience have voted, and should I say 82%. So everybody's awake out there. And we're just going to show you the results there. So weaponization took half the audience, context collapse in next place, and information overload close to insignificant, and other at 4%. And if anybody who is typing in other feels like it, please do type into the chat room what you thought the other was, and I'll feed that into the conversation with Ed. Ed, any comments on that?
No, interestingly for me, my most significant risk factor is actually context collapse. I think that now I've discovered this this philosopher's work quite recently, and now I've encountered it. I sort of see it everywhere. So that would be my top one. But I think weaponization of data is very obvious that this is a feature of political discourse now, and I think it does debase the currency. Michael, you'll know I'm a good Greshamite. And I'm always alive to the risks of debasing of any currency.
Yeah, indeed, yes. Gresham's law, and that is another one we could have fun on. What is the proper quotation of Gresham's law?
Well, I'll maybe get to that in the chat. Let's quickly move on.
Let's stick to the subject, Michael. Yes.
So I've only got 2 slides left, and that is I just want to say, why is it that we, in my team at the Office for Statistics Regulation, why do we do what we do? It's because we think statistics and data are a public good. They serve the public good when they meet a wide range of users, when they're able to hold government account and inform public debate, when they influence choices. And I think to do that, they need to be aware of the risks of context collapse, aware of the risks of weaponization, and they need to avoid information overload. For that reason, we always need to think about trustworthiness, quality, and value in everything that we do. So that's all I was going to cover. I hope that's useful and interesting. I'll be fascinated to hear what people have to say. Apologies for rattling through my material, but I wanted to get to the question and answer as quickly as I could. So I will stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully we can have a debate. Thank you.
That is absolutely superb, Ed. Exactly the way the FS Club likes this. And we do have a number of questions. Please do fill in some more. I'd like to start off with one that certainly bothers me. One, as a statistician, I'm used to presenting ranges. That's what I like to see. Well, secondly, I'm on the board of a regulator which regulates laboratories and others. We would obviously expect to see ranges of accuracy. And of course, FS Club and Zien have been big proponents of confidence accounting, which is an intellectually well-supported movement to begin to represent most of the material items on balance sheets and P&L statements, cash flows as ranges, which is what they are. So there we go. This is from Peter Lansdorf. Peter is a professor up at Cambridge, used to head up, I believe, mathematics and statistics. Peter's question is, as a physicist, I wonder why the ONS does not give errors on the data it announces. It would make them much more meaningful.
Thank you, Peter, for the question. So I don't obviously speak for the ONS, I speak as the ONS's overseer, and I agree with you, and it's something that we are constantly pushing ONS to do better. In fact, we published a piece in September on uncertainty, which drew on a lot of the work done by David Spiegelhalter on how to communicate uncertainty in a way that retains trustworthiness. We are constantly encouraging ONS to do more here. And I think, very briefly, the reluctance in the official statistics world to do this is misplaced. It's a misplaced fear that if you publish a range, you might imply that you don't really know, and that might undermine your trustworthiness. All of the empirical evidence, including experimental evidence done by David Spiegelhalter's team at the Winton Center, suggests that's not right, and actually it enhances people's confidence in you if you are honest about the range of uncertainty. So Peter, I completely support that. I think it's a great thing that is something we're constantly pushing to be done better.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Ed? Because if you look at the Bank of England and its fan charts, where it's basically saying we have a model and we now fan out from today. Nevertheless, they sort of imply that today we're absolutely sure where we are.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's kind of the exact opposite. You'd almost say, well, I'll start with a fan model. My model actually gave me a single number unless I ran it multiple times, but I start off with a high degree of uncertainty. And that's actually, I think, one of the great paradoxes if you're looking at things like chaos theory. It's not just that you can barely, a small change in the initial conditions drives you up a completely different path, but what are the odds you actually know the initial conditions accurately? So there. Now, Martha Bennett said the reason that she chose other was that to her, lack of data literacy is a key cause of
Ah,
data misuse.
yeah. This is a thing we give a lot of thought to, and I'm always reluctant to argue that there's a problem of lack of data literacy. And there's two reasons I have for saying that. I'd be really interested in Martha's comments on what I'm about to say, because this is just our thoughts. It's not a sort of gospel, but our thoughts are one. It's not entirely clear what we mean by data literacy. Do we mean the ability to understand some basic quantitative mathematical concepts? Do we mean the ability to do the math that people need to do to get through their daily life? Or do we mean sort of more specific knowledge that is relevant to understanding official statistics, like employment is based on a survey, GDP is a complicated composite measure. And I think sometimes when people talk about data literacy, they toggle between those things, and it's not entirely clear. So the first reason is I'm often a bit unsure exactly what is meant by data literacy. Second reason is I think it's easy for concerns about data literacy to come across as people like me in parts of the official statistics world to be saying the problem isn't us, it's the people out there who aren't bright enough to understand our great work. So I rather turn it on its head and say it's the job of the ONS, of government departments, when they communicate data and statistics, to understand how the public consume and appreciate numbers and to adapt how they communicate them to that. Now, I do recognise there are alternative views there, but that's the way I've always come to it, which is not to lead off with data literacy being a problem.
Well, some of the statistics on people's just basic numeracy are pretty poor. Here in the city, I'm one of the trustees of the Lord Mayor's Appeal. In fact, strangely, that's the symbol. And we adopted national numeracy as our charity this year because until we have numeracy, we can't do financial literacy or data literacy or statistical literacy. And the numbers for adults in the UK are frightening, the amount that get out of school and are unable to do some of the basics. So thank you for that. Now, Clive Bullen, we're going to wander into a little bit of politics here, and I'm very conscious, Ed, that there's some things you may wish to defer on. That's absolutely okay. But Clive's curious. The trust budget didn't meet the trustworthiness criteria. It was not checked, and many numbers seem to be untrue in politics regularly. Is there anything the OSR can do about this in advance?
What we can do in advance is to be relentless advocates of the value of communicating in a trustworthy way, being clear about the quality and the limitations on quality, and explaining what the numbers, how they are relevant to the user, to advocate relentlessly for TQV, to establish a set of norms that are costly for politicians to infringe. Now, I think that the trust budget or the Kwarteng budget had lots of very obviously negative consequences in financial markets and so on. But I think it's also worth saying it did reinforce the value of institutional rigor, the value of having an OBR, for example, as an independent fiscal watchdog. So in one sense, I think one can draw from that quite a useful sort of normative argument to say actually these things that we relentlessly advocate for do matter. If the question is, can we pre-check things before they go out? The answer is no, because of course once we start to do that, we then ourselves become participants in the policy cycle, and we have to be independent and separate from it. So I'd say we can do something in advance, which is to be advocates, as I am in this talk, for the very high standards of presentation of data, but we can't sort of pre-clear things. I think that would involve us it would enmesh us too closely into the political process, the policy process.
One of the things that bothered me, I mean, you brought Boris Johnson up, and that blasted bus. I mean, whatever the politics you may hold, that was an egregious, again, misuse. The 350,000 was technically our payment to the EU, if you looked at it that way, but actually by the time you looked at what we got back, it was close to level-ish or something. And yet that sailed through with not really many successful attacks on it. You wrote to Matt Hancock, how do politicians typically react to being hauled up? Do they just ignore you? Do they formally write back, the minister takes account of this and will hand it on to relevant officers? Do they object and engage with you, or what do they do?
Well, it varies. So there's not a uniform response. However, I think overall, I'd say our experience is positive. We do raise publicly issues where politicians have used statistics in ways that are not consistent with what statistics themselves say, and we get different kinds of reactions. We occasionally get a reaction of reasserting, no, my approach is right. That's very rare. What more often happens is they say, of course we support everything you say and we'll try again harder next time, but in this case we think we probably got it right. But by far the most significant response is for them to say, actually we'll look at that and we'll recognize the issue, and we'll try and avoid making that mistake in future. And you might say, well, how is it that we secure that? I think the principal reason is that we're very clear that we're just giving an opinion, the opinion as an independent statistical body. We're not ourselves politicians, and we never politicize what we say. So what we do is we'll say, in this particular use, this is the correct interpretation of that particular phenomenon, and we leave it to others to make the political weather of that, which means that we never are ourselves drawn into, you don't see me touring the TV studios making our case. And I think that's very, very important to show that we are sort of a detached opinion giver as opposed to an actor in political debate. And by and large, that seems to secure legitimacy amongst politicians, I'd say. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, they will listen and they will endeavour to do things better in future.
Hugh Purser is curious. I think he makes a good point here. He says disinformation can be delivered instantly and broadly, especially by social media. But to use your phrase, scrubbing the glow takes time, and the message probably won't reach the original audience of the disinformation. And surely, just to take the two cases we raised now, the bus has never come home and bit. The unemployment numbers really never came home and bit. And we still have a national debate to be had on vaccination and the response to the pandemic. But on these, what can we do to speed up the scrubbing the glow off?
I think that's something we wrestle with, because with the best will in the world, we are not as agile as an algorithm which recycles the misstatement. We're quite agile, but we're definitely not as agile as an algorithm which recycles the statement. So the way we think about this is to say, well, firstly, what's the outcome that we want? The outcome that we want is not, and I whilst I agree with the question, I sort of slightly disagree on a couple of the examples that you gave. So, for example, the employment case, the outcome we want is that we don't want people to be misled about what the statistics actually say. And after our repeated interventions on the employment case, it was very rarely reported verbatim as 430,000 without our and other people's takedown of it. So we got to the point that it was always accompanied with its own rebuttal, so to speak, whenever it was quoted. And I think that's the goal that we want. What we want is people not to be misled. I think it is a challenge for us, and I'm not going to pretend I've got like a fantastic answer. This point about algorithms which circulate the falsehood, we try and be as quick as we can. We try and make sure that our material gets to people who themselves can cycle it across social media. But I think it's one of the phenomena of context collapse, that we probably are in one particular context, and reaching out into the other contexts is a challenge. If anybody's got any suggestions as to how we can kind of supercharge how we do that, I'd love it, because that is a challenge for us.
Do you not have a lot of allies, though? I mean, we reference the OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility. You know, politicians will frequently take out ads, so there's advertising standards. We've got a lot of fact-checking sites. So somebody who's making a statement about, say, employment, you know, the OBR is saying, well, that's not how we see it, or you know, it was posted on a billboard. You know, the advertising standard says, sorry, this is factually misleading, or however we want to phrase it. Do you not have a lot of allies? I mean, everybody I speak to in the world would like to have this area cleaned up, except for some narrow thing that they're trying to get across, but they'd like everybody else to get rid of disinformation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we have very close interaction with the Advertising Standards Authority and with Ofcom. We talk regularly to the OBR, that there is, and Full Fact, who are a fact checker, and some of the other fact checkers like the Channel 4 fact checking blog. We talk to them regularly, and in fact, only today I was in a meeting which involved several organisations of that nature, and we were talking about transparency, how to enhance transparency of data in government. So yeah, we do have allies, and some of those allies do frankly have more reach than we do, and we you know, we're very happy for them to magnify, amplify our work. So yeah, we're not fighting this struggle alone, and I'm not pessimistic either. To go back to Gresham, I think the good data, if the good data are presented appropriately, engagingly, accessibly, I think they can drive out the bad data.
Well, let's just return to one thing. When we skipped a little bit over your point there about context collapse. So for me, watching the presentation, I'll be honest, I kind of thought, well, it was actually weaponization, but you've got me convinced a little bit about the idea that context collapse might be, if you had to pick one of the three, and truthfully all of them are there, the one that we ought to be focusing on. Would you mind just redefining it a bit? Because I'm not sure I could go into the pub and explain it to somebody at the moment.
So the idea of context collapse is that before we had a social media world in which we're all, so to speak, producers, authors, editors of our own narratives. Before that, and this is Lucy McDonald's argument, we had our conversations in quite defined separate buckets. We had family conversations and friend conversations, and conversations in the pub, and conversations at work, and conversations with strangers on a train, for example. The idea of context collapse says all of those things, all of those neat swim lanes have eroded, and we're now all in this big kind of the swim lanes have gone from the swimming pool. We're all in the swimming pool together. Some of us are trying to do lanes, some of us are trying to do diving, some of us are just trying to have fun with our kids. You know, it's all messed up. And the point about context collapse is not simply that observation, but that then means that data can quite quickly be published for one purpose, but but leave that purpose and be used in some other way, in a way that then misinforms, because it happens so quickly and so fluidly. And of course, the other thing about the online world is that some of the conversations can become quite what's the word, quite adversarial, you know, so you get sort of not just people not understanding which swim lane they're in, but actually trying to actively disrupt the swim lane. So that's the idea of context collapse. It makes this whole area of use of data much more contested and complex. But how did I do, Michael? That's the sort of idea.
I think that's good. You know, I know a little bit about it, and they talk about flattening of multiple audiences, but to me, it's the idea that we've got a single piece of information. Well, it's not a single piece of information being used for wildly different purposes, and everybody thinking that it's the same thing, and each one actually needed a different piece of information. That's how I typically explain it. I'm not sure that's much better, but it's my attempt.
My UKHSA example, the vaccines, this technical output, weekly surveillance report, then being used in the way it was, that is like a par excellence example of context collapse. It was something being ripped out of one context and used in another, and actually the health body being very slow to realize this was what was going on.
Yeah, and I think those of us who've got larger followings than average have a responsibility to put the context of information that you're providing.
Yeah.
You know, if you're online, you've got 10,000 followers, you should pause just a minute and think, are all of them going to follow where I'm going on this, or are they going to take it out of context? Yeah. Well, Hugh Purser put in a lovely quote. Really, is it a thing that some folks are going to want to believe certain stats and data regardless of whether they are true? And that, I think, leads on to a point I really liked here. I was going to kind of not exactly close on, but Nick Bush, and this is the importance. You raise the idea of narrative. Nick says the problem we face here is that the public in general prefers stories with data to match, but it's the stories that we follow rather than stories arising from data. How can we tell a good story about better use of data?
Well, I hope that's what I've been doing. I hope that's my goal. I mean, one thing to say is this is a human universal that we like stories. It's what a feature of us as a species is that we like stories. So I'm not somebody who says we've got to get rid of stories and just rely on cold hard analytics. I think that way we'll not make any progress at all doing that. What I think is a better way of thinking is to say it's inevitable people use stories. It's inevitable that people want to use statistics modally. They want to say not what world are we in, but what world could we be in if we did something differently. And my job is to just make sure that when they're doing that, they're doing so in a way which is faithful to the underlying statistic, that they're not sort of, as I said again, debasing that currency. So my mission is quite humble. It's to preserve the ability for data to exist in stories in a good and healthy way, and not exist in them in this kind of rather toxic, weaponized, context collapsed way.
Well, we opened with a question from Peter Lansoff, and I'll close with a comment. Peter says, when Patricia Hewitt was in government and gave a lecture in Cambridge, she said her permanent secretary told her 50% of the population do not know what 50% means, which is and Ed, I'm going to test you now. Gresham's law, is it good money drives out bad, or bad money drives out good?
Well, I'm gonna completely duck that, because I'm gonna say, well, you know, nobody knows what Gresham said. You know, he didn't write this down in any kind of coherent way, which is what has become his law. So I'd say that it's a trick question you've asked me, Michael, to try to get me to pin me down, when in fact nobody knows what Gresham said. He didn't really say the thing that he's alleged to have said, but he actually said the bad money drives out the good. But anyway, he didn't say it. He had that quote.
I think the way I'd phrase it is the answer probably is good money drives out bad at the theory level, not what Gresham actually said, because that was attributed centuries later. And secondly, if you want to say bad money drives out good, you should add if it's forced to trade at the same price.
Yeah.
I think the quote I might really like to end on is a quick one from Bertrand Russell in Education and the Good Life. He said, intelligence enables a man to be moved emotionally by statistics, So the mark of an intelligent person is that he or she can be moved emotionally by statistics. And I won't ask if statistics sometimes make all of us cry at night, but it has been absolutely wonderful to have you here. If I may do 3 quick rounds of thanks, first and foremost to our sponsors who allow us to do these things and have extra special guests in like Ed today. You've really kept the audience attention and it's been fascinating and interesting. And people are already typing into the chat room their thanks, which will be sent on to you. Secondly, can I thank the audience? You've been particularly vibrant and erudite today. What more should I expect? As ever, please do have a look at the website for forthcoming events. It's the easiest way to do things. But we do have a couple, well, sorry, 3 coming in before Christmas that should be interesting. And we're going to be kicking off the year, as we always do, on the 9th of January with our traditional update on EU financial services legislation by David Doyle. But finally, most seriously, the thanks is really due to you. I appreciate you taking the time and being so open with everybody here, particularly in a sensitive position where you're a regulator and you have to deal with politicians, to give us some insights into what that's like and what we all need to do to keep everybody in society on their toes.
Thank you so much. I've loved it. Wish we could have had longer. Been great. Thank you.